Hello friends, this is Grief speaking. Many of you may be familiar with my Body Horror Iceberg video series that I finally completed after 7 tiers, 7 videos, and hundreds of body horror entries. Well, we're back, baby. The original iceberg chart was actually still being updated as I was making the videos, and since then there have been dozens more entries added to it. So many in fact that I just decided to make a whole nother set of videos going through all of the lost entries. There's new stuff added to every tier, so I just decided why not do it the way we always do it and start at tier 1 working our way down through the missing entries. There's plenty of new body horror here and just crazy new discoveries in general, so shout out to Dripcat and Sybil for creating the iceberg. Honestly, it really is the gift that just keeps on giving, so let's just not waste any more time. This is the Body Horror Iceberg, the lost entries. Tier 1, Contra. Contra is the beloved Konami side-scrolling shooter, and the series has its fair share of monstrous enemies, particularly in Neo Contra, which is really chock full of hideous bosses, including Gigabon, the giant mutated tentacle baby head. Man, that thing's gnarly. Metal Slug. Metal Slug was always my favorite arcade shooter as a kid. It seemed more rare than a lot of the other games, and the animation and art style always stood out to me. But enough waxing nostalgic. The series mostly focuses on military tech, especially for the bosses, but it does dip into supernatural territory with clone incubators, mummies, creepy aliens like the Root Mars who have their brains exposed, and even demons. What a fun series. Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat is probably the most obvious one here, and I can't believe it wasn't on the original iceberg. The amount of brutal bodily injuries and horrific kills in this series could be an iceberg all on its own. Star Wars Saga. There's a lot that could be categorized as body horror in the Star Wars saga. Even if you don't count the aliens themselves, you still have people getting their limbs chopped off with lightsabers, Luke being shoved into a butchered tauntaun, and Anakin being almost burned alive with most of his appendages missing, and there's many more examples past that. Surrealism. I believe this is referring to the genre of art itself, which makes sense considering some of the disturbing artwork coming from surrealism. Some examples are actually found elsewhere on the iceberg, like the premonition of war, but there is an endless list of off-putting body imagery in this category. Salvador Dali's The Great Masturbator, for instance. I love the title, by the way. Terminator. The false flesh ripping away to reveal the robotic T-800 underneath is body horror enough, and this is made more disturbing in Terminator Salvation when a character doesn't even realize they're a Terminator until they see the metal under their torn flesh. Imagine that revelation. The Grim Adventures of Billy and Mandy. This series is full of dark horror tropes, and body horror is definitely one of them. Even the intro has Billy and Mandy being brought from skeleton to muscle to skin. If you really want to go deep though, the original short that Billy and Mandy is based off of, called Billy and Mandy and Trepanation of the Skull and You, is really disturbing. The black and white simple animation seems like something out of a Lost Media creepypasta, and the whole premise is that Mandy has drilled a hole in her head to relieve pressure supposedly brought on by an evolutionary defect, causing the brain to be too big for the skull. Mandy then convinces Billy to do the same, and after drilling the hole into his head, it spurts blood. A lot of blood. This short is awesome. It's one of the times I'm really thankful for this iceberg where I may never have found it. The King of Fighters. The characters Laurie and Leona both have Orochi transformations which turn them more vicious and beast-like. The Passion of the Christ. Oof, didn't know we'd get into this territory. Well, in Mel Gibson's film The Passion of the Christ, Jesus is brutally beaten and tortured throughout. Probably the most jarring scene being when he is whipped with a specific kind of whip that has glass shards in the end of it. It's a pretty brutal movie, and some people even consider it a torture film, which by definition it kind of is. One thing I don't hear people mention very often about this movie is that there's a really bizarre scene where what is supposedly Satan taunts Jesus, and he looks like this weird small baby with a creepy ass smile. No disrespect to the actor, but that is fucking terrifying. Tokyo Ghoul. Tokyo Ghoul is an anime set in an alternate reality where creatures called ghouls exist. These creatures look like normal people but can only survive by eating human flesh. The series is full of blood and gore, and the ghoul transformations can be pretty wild. Also, there are half ghouls which can either be born naturally as a ghoul and human's offspring, or, and here's some more body horror, artificially created by transplanting some ghoul organs into a human. Okay, we're already to tier 2. Aberrat. Aberrat is a series of books by Clive Barker, who you might recognize as the writer-director of Hellraiser and the author of The Hellbound Heart, the novella the film was based on. Aberrat follows a girl named Candy who travels into a parallel world through a lighthouse, meeting strange humanoid friends and foes. It's chock full of creepy stuff, including a character named John Mischief who has large antlers on his head. These antlers have 7 heads protruding from them, which are John's brothers. Also, there's characters known as stitchlings, zombie-like minions filled with mud, and occasionally random internal organs stitched together from random bits of old rotting flesh. And of course the antagonist, whose face is surrounded by a vat of liquid in which electrical pulsing nightmares swim that come from tubes embedded in his skull. That's not even half of it. This book is crazy, dude. Back 4 Blood. Back 4 Blood is a cooperative zombie shooter game and spiritual successor to Left 4 Dead. Like Left 4 Dead, the game features mutated zombies on top of the typical hordes. Each of these special type zombies are examples of body horror with heavily distorted bodies. BoJack Horseman. BoJack is an adult animated comedy series, and although it doesn't usually have a lot of scares, there are some horror moments sprinkled in. Most notably a scene where BoJack has a drug trip where he witnesses Diane transform into a nightmare abomination. The animation is great here, and she really looks grotesque. Bruce Almighty, How Many Fingers? This is in direct reference to the scene in Bruce Almighty where Bruce is having God guess how many fingers he's holding up. Eventually he's about to hold up 7, 5 on one hand and 2 on the other, but quickly changes it to 5, only holding up the one hand, but when he puts his hand up, he all of a sudden has 7 fingers on it. It's mostly a goof, but still a little freaky. Cannibal Corpse. Cannibal Corpse is a death metal band known for their depraved lyrics and absolutely horrific album covers that are usually focused on brutal acts of violence involving dead bodies. Some examples of their songs are I Come Blood, about digging up a woman's corpse to have sex with it, Entrails Ripped from a Virgin's Cunt. This one's about tying a woman to a bed and disemboweling her via her uterine cavity, then raping the emptied body. Necropedophile, well, you can guess that one. Jesus, well, there goes the monetization on this video. Chainsaw Man. Man, I feel like I can't stop hearing about this damn show. Chainsaw Man just suddenly infested the internet the last couple of months for some reason. Anyway, it's pretty self-explanatory. A human merges with a devil, giving him chainsaw powers. Okay, that actually sounds pretty cool. Syriac. Syriac is a YouTube animator that primarily manipulates images of people and animals into horror-like abominations. You've probably seen one of his videos floating around on YouTube, even if you didn't realize it. Kent J. Starrett. Kent J. Starrett is an illustrator and author whose work features a lot of horror elements, including Human Resources, his anthology book, where almost every short story is full of body horror. In Immunity, a man cultivates open wounds, grotesque hygiene, and repulsive eating habits to build up an immunity to death itself, becoming part of an inhuman conclave of like-minded abominations in the process. And in Children of Light and Darkness, there's a cellar full of human children who have been lobotomized, given limb extensions and reductions, subjected to endless skin grafts, and otherwise surgically modified by a seemingly loving foster couple. Max Goof's Nightmare. In Goofy Movie, one of the best and underrated Disney films, Max has a dream about the girl he has a crush on that quickly turns into a nightmare when he begins transforming to look like an exaggerated version of his father, Goofy. It's a great scene. Monty Python and the Holy Grail. I think this is on the list, if anything, for the Black Knight scene, one of the most iconic and hilarious scenes from any of the Monty Python films, where a Black Knight blocks Sir Arthur's path, refusing to yield defeat even when all of his limbs are chopped off. Pink Floyd's The Wall. You might be familiar with this song, but you might have missed the music video, in which a teacher is represented as a caricature, both with a live-action puppet and an animation. His strange appearance might be enough, but there's also a point in the video where he mashes kids into a meat grinder. It's actually a really cool video. Rourke's Death, Atlantis the Lost Empire. In Atlantis, the underrated animated film, the main antagonist, Commander Rourke, is cut with a shard of the mythical crystal known as the Heart of Atlantis. This changes Rourke's skin so that he becomes a crystal abomination right before he explodes by being hit with a propeller. Sherry S. Tepper. Sherry S. Tepper is a sci-fi and horror author whose work is just chock full of body horror. In one novel, Shadows in exchange for humans being permitted to live on the planet Denad, when a woman experiences her first pregnancy, she is then gang raped by a native race called the Kachis. Several Kachis grow in her womb, eating the human fetus for sustenance. In another novel, Gibbon's Decline and Fall, the main villain envisions a world where women exist in mindless, suspended animation. The only part of their body utilized is the womb, used only to produce offspring. Terraria. Terraria is full of disturbing enemies, including the Face Monster, Floaty Gross, and the Wall of Flesh. The Binding of Isaac. The Binding of Isaac follows a young boy whose fanatical Christian mother begins hearing the voice of God. She then strips him naked, confines him to his bedroom, and accepts a commission to kill him and sacrifice to prove her devotion. Isaac discovers her intentions and manages to escape into the basement, where, still naked, he goes on the run as he fights off nightmares, both physical and mental. The game is a real nightmare show and full of body horror because most power-ups do horrible things to you in exchange for their effects. In no particular order, you may grow tumors, become a living insect hive, acquire tons of diseases, cry blood, prop your eyes open with toothpicks, jam implants into your eyes, and so many more. The Suffering. This is one of those games I've always heard about but never played. The thing that always stood out to me was the fact that blood slowly covers the character as you play, which was really a cool concept at the time. But as far as the body horror goes, this is up there with Resident Evil and Silent Hill. The enemies are all grotesque monstrosities called malefactors, which are a collection of monsters, demons, and or human souls that embody the different types of killing that people have inflicted on one another throughout history. Damn, that's some metal shit, man. I gotta play this game. High on Life. High on Life is the recently released comedy shooter developed by Squanch Games in which the protagonist, a bounty hunter, uses talking guns as weapons. One character/gun, Creature, is the end result of amoral experimentation. He has several parts that appear to be mostly exposed nerves, especially his open-air womb/magazine bit, and the bounty hunter has to insert their hand into him via a sphincter. He also produces offspring as ammunition. Fucking weird, dude. MGMT Kids. This referring to the Kids music video. The video follows a toddler and his mother as they travel through the city. The thing is, the toddler sees everyone as hideous, gory monsters, something the mother clearly is not seeing. It's a pretty freaky video, and they did a really good job at the makeup, costumes, and props here. The video's actually gained a lot of criticism because the kid seems genuinely terrified, and so a lot of people think it verges on child abuse to scare the shit out of a kid like this just for the purposes of a video. However, there was a behind-the-scenes video release where the kid seems to be laughing and having a great time with the monsters and puppets. I don't know, it's a tricky one. Tier 3. Bet you didn't know I was 5% salamander. This is actually in reference to a scene in the Animaniacs reboot where Wacko Warner's tail is ripped off. He then exclaims, "Bet you didn't know I was 5% salamander," and his tail regrows in a particularly disgusting fashion. It really comes out of nowhere. Watermelon, A Cautionary Tale. This is a cute and strange animated short film based on the old wives' tale that if you swallow a watermelon seed, a watermelon will grow in your stomach. We watch as a boy deals with this exact problem, and it's more comical than horrifying. American McGee's Alice. American McGee's Alice is essentially a really dark and disturbing version of Alice in Wonderland. In this tale, Alice's family has died in a fire of which she's the only survivor. The trauma leaves her mostly catatonic and suicidal, and she's institutionalized in an asylum. Years later, her White Rabbit plush toy apparently comes to life and summons Alice to aid a radically altered Wonderland. It's a very cool premise, and I just always love it when people have dark takes on stuff like this. It's full of over-the-top blood and gore with tons of body horror as well, as Alice is profoundly disturbed, and this reflects in Wonderland's people. Like various deformed children running around in the school in Hatter's Asylum, some of whom have the tops of their skulls sawed off. Then there's the March Hare and the Dormouse. The March Hare is missing all of his limbs, and 3 have been replaced with crude prosthetics. His eyes are held open by staples, and his lower lip is pulled far down his face. Dormouse has his legs removed, his brain exposed, and most of his tail has been replaced by metal links. Just another game I gotta sit down and play sometime. Black Swan. So before researching this, I didn't know much about Black Swan. I just knew it was some artsy film that won an Oscar a while back, but I never would have guessed that it's full of psychological terror and body horror. So slight spoilers here, but the main character, a ballerina, begins suffering hallucinations as she prepares for a performance that is breaking her psychologically. Besides some more mild but still cringy stuff like how fucked up ballerina's feet get from dancing, the main reason this is on the list is because she starts having hallucinations that she is literally becoming a swan, and this manifests by way of her neck elongating, her eyes going completely red, the goosebumps on her arms erupt into actual feathers, she starts pulling bloody black feathers from her back, and the skin on her toes fuse together, becoming webbed. Blasphemous. Blasphemous is a hack-and-slash Metroidvania game that takes place in a dark and unforgiving world where people's sins have physically manifested due to something called the Grievous Miracle, which has twisted humans into painful monstrosities. There are a lot of enemies and non-enemies that fit the bill here, including a lot of the bosses. Cube Zero. Cube Zero is the 3rd film in the Cube franchise and is easily the most gory, with standout scenes like a man drinking what he thinks is flavored water, only to realize it's some kind of acid. It causes the skin on his arms and then that of his face to fall off, revealing the bloody tissue beneath, and then he melts into a pile of gory skin and flesh. Also, several razor wires shoot across a room, wrapping themselves around a man's limbs, which then slowly tighten until the man's head, arms, legs, and waist are sliced into large bloody chunks. Hungry Lamu. This is a weird one. Hungry Lamu is a free-to-play horror indie game. The game starts as a simple 2D collection game where you play as Lamu, who's hungry and searching for food. It starts off innocently enough as you eat some cherries. Eventually this leads to him eating a banana dog and 3 fruit people. After this, the game takes a dark turn. You're now playing a first-person horror game where you're on the same campgrounds Lamu just was. Only these aren't fruit people, they're actually your friends that Lamu has mutilated and eaten, including your dog, who was no banana. It's kind of a cool setup, and there are multiple endings where you can try and uncover the truth behind Lamu's unstoppable hunger. Phantasm. Phantasm is a cult classic horror movie and franchise that follows the Tall Man, the antagonist and sinister supernatural undertaker. The films are full of gory deaths, but the true horror comes into what happens to the dead. The Tall Man reanimates them, crushing their bodies down to dwarf size and enslaving them to be zombie dwarf slaves. Damn. Save Ralph. Save Ralph is a short film made by the Humane Society of America. It feels fairly upbeat at first, although Ralph's right eye is clearly dead and he can't hear out of his right ear. He then mentions the fact that he has chemical burns up and down his back. Eventually Ralph is taken into a lab where a chemical is poured onto his eye, and I have to say, despite the slightly cartoonish look overall, the stop motion animation is top notch and this scene is very hard to watch. Afterwards, Ralph is shown with gnarly burns on his back and now both his eyes completely messed up. It's a very sad short and it's pretty effective in making you feel uncomfortable. Skin Tom. Skin Tom is an old urban legend about a man who takes a woman out to Lover's Lane, not realizing she was married. The woman's husband follows her only to find the two having sex in his car. The angry husband stabs his wife in the stomach and throws her aside, then proceeds to skin Tom alive. The police arrest the husband but never actually find Tom, only his filleted skin. The legend says he's still out there haunting Lover's Lane as a skinless monster with a knife. Okay, that's just fun. I don't think we've really done a lot of schoolyard urban legends like that, so it's kind of cool to see it on the list. Suspiria. Suspiria is an Italian horror film from 1977 about a ballet student who goes to a dance academy in Germany. However, several bizarre deaths surrounding the school turn her study abroad into a nightmare. So, some spoilers here. It turns out that the headmistress of the school is essentially an undead witch, which is where the body horror comes into play. It's also worth noting that there was a 2018 remake of this film where the headmistress, Helena Marcos, looks even more terrifying, being a hideous mess. There's also a scene where a woman transforms and has a massive gaping bloody vagina form on her chest. Plus, there's a great scene of a woman's body being violently twisted and broken in a horrible way by magic. Both movies seem highly disturbing. Sweet Home. In a previous Iceberg video, I covered Sweet Home, the Japanese horror film and video game adaptation, but I noticed while doing the research that there's actually a Korean horror comic and TV show of the same name that has plenty of body horror itself. It's about a post-apocalyptic event that turns people into monsters, and a group of people attempt to survive this in an apartment building. The monsters in the show look pretty cool and freaky, and I just thought it was worth a mention. The Book of Lost Things. The Book of Lost Things is a novel about a boy who loses his mother to a terminal illness. After this, he enters a fantasy world full of strange creatures and mythical people. One of these is known as the Huntress, who, in an attempt to create a more entertaining breed of prey, has resorted to decapitating children and attaching their heads to animals. The Callisto Protocol. The Callisto Protocol is a sci-fi horror action game that features body horror galore in the form of the biophage pathogen, which turns humans into grotesque undead-like creatures. ThisPersonDoesn'tExist.com. This is a very strange one and maybe a stretch in terms of body horror, but I'll let you be the judge of that. ThisPersonDoesn'tExist.com is a website that, when entered, will simply show you the portrait of a person. The thing is, the person is completely AI generated. These are not real people at all. You can refresh over and over, just getting constant portraits of people that look like any other human. It's kind of insane and a little eerie. American Psycho. American Psycho is a fairly disturbing film, but not at all by comparison to the book, which takes the torture to a much more depraved level. In case you don't know anything about American Psycho, it's about a wealthy businessman in New York who's secretly a serial killer. There's some very brutal acts in this book, and just a fair warning, these are very graphic, but they involve burning a woman's eyeball with a lighter till it explodes, using a chainsaw to cut a girl in half, then pulling her legs away while she's still conscious, grinding up a girl into hamburger meat and eating it, and probably the most disturbing, using acid to widen the opening of a girl's girl's vagina, then forcing a starved rat inside to eat through her womb and stomach. Damn, that's one of the most brutal things I've heard on this iceberg in a while. Dogscape. Dogscape is a very surreal creepypasta. It's based on the concept that the world suddenly becomes completely engulfed in dog flesh. Essentially everything natural in the world is made up of living dog parts. The story is told in a series of logs written by a man named Doc. I'll read an excerpt from log 4. The Dogscape, that's what we call it. Us humans that banded together, I mean. We sit around campfires and cook the whelps we collect from the dog trees. The only flammable material we have is the acrid fur that grows everywhere. It offends all senses, but soon the meal is prepared. The only food sources are the dog trees and the mother mounds. Some, foolish enough, dig for meat. Though the reward is great, many don't come back, for the dog flesh regrows above them, trapping them inside the moist ground. So, you get the idea. It's great because the concept is really ridiculous and should be silly, but it just actually plays out so unnerving at the same time. As you can see, there's some really cool things in the updated iceberg, and we still have 4 more tiers to go, so stay tuned for more body horror next week. I do want to just take a moment here to say that I have made a Patreon. If you feel so inclined to become a patron, the link is in the description, and it would really help me a lot from a production standpoint so that I can make bigger and better content. Right now, I've added just 1 tier that includes everything I have to offer on Patreon. Most immediately would be getting a shout out at the end of every video, but there's going to be consistent content rolling out on there weekly, including deeper dives on the icebergs I'm covering, like gameplay videos of some of the more interesting games that have popped up on the iceberg, and just a ton of other bonus content, like behind the scenes of me actually doing the research for the videos, as well as some live streams in the future, and maybe even a podcast. So like I said, if you like this content and want to support me, give it a look-see, and if you can't or aren't interested, I fully appreciate you watching my videos at all. So thanks again, everybody. Shout out to Kill Me Katie for the music. This is Grief speaking. Goodbye, friends.